Well, I'd love to say that it's a real pleasure to be asked to open the conference, but I designed the programme myself. So I just thank myself for the opportunity and... So I don't know how many times you've been to church, but you may have seen, like me, notice sheets which don't quite make sense. And apologies if you've heard this before, but I sometimes send my mum these actual notice sheet sentences. On Tuesday at St Cuthbert's, the low self-esteem group meets in the church hall. Please use the back door. Due to complications with the facilities in the North Narthex, during today's service we will be baptising babies at both ends. And then one of the funniest things I've ever heard in church in my whole life, being as it's Easter Sunday, this morning during the morning service, Mrs Ormskirk will come forward and lay an egg on the altar. Ah, dear. Great stuff. Dear old Mrs Ormskirk. So I want to do three things this evening. I want to firstly expand our understanding of how big God is. Secondly, I want to talk about the narrative in Matthew's Gospel where we hear about the story of stepping out of the boat. And thirdly, I want to suggest what that might mean for you and I and for Outlook. So, as Christian people, followers of what was first called the Way, we need to realise that our image of God, however we see him, is too small. The psalmist said, "Your ways, O Lord, are too lofty for me to attain. I cannot understand them." I cannot understand what you are doing. How many of us in our Christian journey have said, "You know what, Lord, I cannot understand what you are doing." We are seeing through a glass dimly. And this blindness and misunderstanding is all around us. So I don't know if you've ever been on a thing called the internet, but there is a website called YouTube, and YouTube plays these clips, these video clips. And I saw one the other day which made me laugh out loud. It's filmed by this gentleman, and it's filmed by his girlfriend, and he's opened a suitcase with a fox in it and 3 cubs. It's a true video. You can see it online. And he's concerned why on earth there would be a suitcase in the woods with a fox and 3 cubs in it. So he rings the RSPCA, and his girlfriend, for whatever reason, films the moment he rings the RSPCA. And he's concerned about the suitcase and the fox and the cubs, and he rings up and he says, "Excuse me, I've found a suitcase with a fox and 3 cubs in it." And the lady at the RSPCA end of the phone, concerned for the animals, says, "Are they moving?" He says, "I don't know, but that would explain the suitcase." And it's true. It's actually a true little clip. Please don't boo me now because it gets an awful lot worse. I'm only on page 2. The misunderstanding of the size of God can stop us in our tracks on our Christian journey. So an understanding of our place in the scheme of things can bring us a calmness and an assurance. Now, as the trustees of the charity will tell you, at an early age I was given the spiritual gift of worrying. And it's hard for me to see the future, the bigger picture where I might be going personally. So let me try and explain the size of God with a little bit of stargazing. Now, it's important to say that in the back playground of God, in the playground of God, feet and inches or centimetres and metres don't work. Furlongs, miles, kilometres are no good. 100 miles is no good. Halfway around the world and back is no good. Now, our planet is 25,000 miles round. I think they call that circumference. So if I walked round the world and came back to Northampton, I set off now, I'd be back in about 11 years. You probably would have left by then, to be fair. But think of our Creator, who the psalmist says in Psalm 33, and this is what the original Hebrew says, "In the word of Yahweh, the heavens they were made, and all the host and the spirit from the mouth of him." So the sense is that God breathed out creation. Now, I don't know about you, but it amuses me that people believe we could be here by chance. It amuses me. What does a chance explosion making all of us make of things like romance and music and laughter and tears and joy and forgiveness and happiness and pain? All those things have no place in an unordered world that just came into being through an explosion. So back to science. The speed of light is a little over, you should know this, is a little over what? Somebody said 14 miles an hour. It's 186,000 miles per second. So if it were possible, if you could shine a torch from one side of the world and back to yourself, it would take 1/7 of a second to get back to you. Now, light takes 1.5 seconds to get to the moon, which is 252,000 miles away. We're starting to get a picture of how big things are. Now, in order to try and comprehend the tiniest part of the universe, we need to think about light years. Now, a light year is the distance that light travels in a year. Now, bearing in mind that light travels at 186,000 miles per second, in a light year, light goes 5.88 trillion miles. That's 5.88 with 12 noughts after it. Are you with me? So if you've got a pad and a pen, write 5.88 and then 12 zeros. That's a light year. Just to give you an idea of millions and trillions and billions and squillions and all that sort of thing, 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days ago. So 1,000,000 seconds ago is 12 days ago. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 36 years and 5 months ago. So that's before my time. 1,000,000,000,000 seconds ago is 29,700 years before the birth of Christ. So 1,000,000,000,000 is quite a lot. And we need this next one a bit later. 1,000,000,000,000 seconds ago, that comes after trillion. 1,000,000,000,000 seconds ago is 30,800,000 years ago. So, if the Earth were the size of a golf ball, every time I do that, every time I say that sentence, I want you to hold up 2 golf balls to me. If the Earth were the size of a golf ball, the sun would be 15 feet in diameter. If the Earth were that big, the sun would be 15 feet in diameter. Right now, if it were possible, we could put 960,000 Earths in the sun. Now, if the Earth were the size of a golf ball, can you see yourself on that Earth? There's a planet called Betelgeuse. That's 427 light years away. If the Earth were a golf ball, Betelgeuse is like 6 Empire State Buildings on top of each other. It's an enormous planet. In fact, we don't have the vocabulary to describe how big it is. But you could fit 262 trillion Earths inside Betelgeuse. Musifi is a bit further away. You could fit 2.7 quadrillion Earths inside Musifi. It's an enormous, we can't comprehend that. It's too big. And then scientists did a really clever thing. They discovered a planet that was even bigger than those, and they called it Canis Major, or in English, the Big Dog. Now, if the Earth were a golf ball, Canis Major is the height of Mount Everest. 6 miles high of golf balls. You could fit 7 quadrillion Earths inside Canis Major. And do you know what? Canis Major isn't even far out into the host of galaxies. But the God who made Canis Major knows every hair on your head. Let me say that again, because I think we get a bit flippant, don't we, with how awesome God is. The God who made Canis Major knows every hair on your head. Every single part of your DNA is known to Jesus of Nazareth. Every single part of your DNA. And actually, Psalm 17, verse 8, where the psalmist talks about the apple of God's eye, the original Hebrew means the little man, because the sense is that God holds us close enough so that there is a reflection of us in the eye of God. That's a beautiful picture of how closely God holds us as he loves his children. Now, from that enormous, enormous, enormous size, inside every cell of your body there is a protein molecule called laminin. Now, I know this from a second-hand story from a molecular biologist. Molecular biology isn't my thing, really. But laminin is a cell adhesion molecule, and that means it holds all the contents of the cell together. It holds the body together. Literally, it holds the body together. Every cell is held together by laminin. And if you put into Google laminin and you type in images of laminin, do you know what shape you get? Laminin is in the shape of a cross. Colossians 1, for by him all things have been created. All things were created by Jesus and for Jesus, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Is it actually possible that God, who flung this vast expanse out beyond the earth when he breathed out, also put the shape of the cross inside every cell within us? Of course it is. Because in Jesus, all things hold together. So, many moons ago, there were a group of timid people, who were young people, incidentally. The disciples, just for the sake of telling you, really, are almost all young people. Peter perhaps was over 18, but because of the way Jewish schooling went, because of various verses in the Bible, because of the original language that Jesus spoke to his disciples in, it's very, very, very probable that the disciples are young people. Whilst our art might show us bearded men, it's really probably rather inaccurate. But in Matthew 14, Jesus is in miracle mode. He's just fed 5,000 men, so probably 10,000 people altogether. Not one of them says, excuse me, I'm gluten-free. Have you got anything other than fish? I'm vegan. I can't really... Jesus dismisses the crowd, and this is where the translation kind of lets us down slightly. When Jesus dismissed the crowd, what did he say? Move along now, nothing to see here. Well, that wasn't true. You're dismissed. The blessing of... He probably didn't do that either. We don't know, and we won't know until we ask him at the other side of this life. But the geography of the area backs up what happens next. So Lake Galilee can act as a funnel for intense weather storms. Now, I don't know what it is about the weather, but British people have a thing. We have a thing about the weather. I think England is the only place on earth where you can greet somebody with a weather forecast. I remember walking past a lady in Hull, And her words to me were, we needed that drop of rain. She didn't say hello, but we do that, don't we? We're fascinated by the weather. It's about 14 degrees, by the way, now, in case you're interested. But we know that in 1992, 10-foot waves from the Sea of Galilee crashed into Tiberias and caused all sorts of damage because violent weather there is not uncommon. So in Matthew 14, the boat, and the Greek calls it the floater. I really like that, the floater. So the floater has floated out 3 or 4 miles onto this lake that covers about 60 square miles, and it's beaten by the waves. And the Greek tells us that the boat is ordealized. It goes through an ordeal at the hands of the storm. Now, that's really interesting. I don't know about you, but my Christian journey hasn't been plain sailing, really at all. Now, there will be those amongst us who have lost, perhaps recently, loved ones. Friends of ours die of cancer, don't they? We go to healing services and we pray for our friends and they're snatched away. One of the things that we learn in our Christian journey is that actually life can be tough. When I was a kid, my parents did this terrible thing. They came out with catchphrases at moments when I didn't need them. You might have had those. So I had great joy when I was a new parent, making up my own. So my children would come into my room in the middle of the night and say, "Dad, I can't sleep." And I would say, "Well, lie on the edge of the bed, you'll soon drop off." And it's a phrase that they will tell their children. It's a great joy to me to annoy my children. "Life's not fair," they'd say. Or "it's not fair." And I'd say, "Well, life's not fair," so it's a good lesson to learn early. Have you ever heard the story of Piggy on the Railway? Have you ever heard that? When something wasn't fair, my mum would say, "Piggy on the railway, picking up stones. Along came an engine and broke Piggy's bones. Oh, said Piggy, that's not fair. Oh, said the engine driver, I don't care." It's an awful story. I was traumatised as a child. But if my children say, "Oh, it's not fair," I'll just say, "Piggy's on the railway." But life is difficult. And in the Bible, there's this great book, which in Yorkshire we call the Book of Job. And Job is a man who suffers terribly. Right at the beginning of the book, Satan asks for permission to test him, and God says, "Yes, but you mustn't harm him because he's one of mine." And Job loses his livelihood, he loses his family. His entire identity is stripped from him. And at the end of the book, Job says, "Do you know what, God, this is really not fair." And then there is a fabulous rant from the Almighty saying, "How dare you tell me what's fair? Were you there when I made the heavens? Were you there when I stored up all the waves in these great storehouses? Were you there?" And Job keeps a very dignified silence. Now, the Bible tells us that Job lived to be a good man, old and full of years. But sometimes the suffering doesn't end with a good finish. Think of a young lady I met once at Spring Harvest called Tracy. And Tracy was a genuine gift from God. Tracy had had an interesting life. She had had a heroin addiction, and she'd been a working girl, a prostitute. And at the height of Tracy's heroin addiction, she spent £700 a day on heroin. Now, if you imagine that in order to fund a habit of £700, you need to have at least twice that every day, you can imagine how chaotic Tracy's life was. Stealing, selling herself, using heroin, going through the same cycle. And Tracy had lost a leg because she once took some bad heroin. She came up to me at the end of a seminar I've been doing at Spring Harvest for young people. She said, "Oh, I just want to tell you, I think you got a bit of that wrong." And of course I put on my polished Christian face to worthily take her criticism and thank her for blessing me with words of discouragement. same face I'll probably use in about 10 minutes' time. And Tracy said, I said, oh, do you teach about it? She said, oh, no, I was a heroin addict. But then God healed me. It's good, isn't it? And she walked off. I said, wait, you're not going anywhere without telling me that story. And Tracy became a friend of ours, and she used to get up and tell her story on stage, and young people, hardened young people, would just be totally flattened by this story. But Tracy's life is still in pieces because the scars of the heroin, the scars of being a working girl, don't heal overnight. How about the people that my mum worked with at the hospice in York? People whose lives were stolen by cancer. How about that? Christian people who died in pain. My mother-in-law, Ruth, my wife and I are separated now, but Ruth was a wonderful woman, full of hospitality. She knew hospitality like nobody else. And the way that Ruth would entertain strangers with her baking was legendary around Shrewsbury where she lived. And one afternoon we got a phone call saying that Ruth had contracted motor neuron disease. And motor neuron disease is an awful way to die. Everything about you remains, your mental focus, your memory, your ability to listen and hear, and your desire to communicate stays. But your body fails, and ultimately you die a painful death. And people prayed for Ruth to be healed. People prayed and rejoiced for Ruth to be healed. But what was so interesting about the life of Ruth Jane Watt was that when she died, at the moment she died and passed into glory, her husband was reading her a passage about a new heaven and a new earth and no more tears. At that very moment, Ruth went home. But life is tough, and life may continue to be tough. And for those people who were followers of Jesus, for those disciples, for those people who were on the floater with him in Matthew's Gospel, Peter himself refused to be crucified in the same manner of Jesus and asked to be crucified upside down. So the story goes, because he didn't feel worthy to die the same death as Jesus. And sometimes we talk about, this is just a bit of an aside really, but I think I should say it. Sometimes we talk about, I can't wait for this period of suffering to be over and then I can get back to normal. But that period of suffering might be normal. That might be your calling. Some of us here suffer with long-term ill health, and I say some of us because I do. Since 1998, I've battled with an illness, and sometimes it will just come and take over. It's a gentle form of depression. But sometimes there are dark nights and depression wins, and I can't fight it. And I'm a committed Christian. I know the verses about prayer overcoming things, but I can't beat depression sometimes. But that's all right. Actually, that's all right. Because I know that God is in the depression. I've learnt to recognize the voice of God amidst the pain. And so it takes 45 minutes for Jesus to walk towards the disciples who are out there on the boat. And if you notice in the passage, Jesus sends them out there. So they are sent into this trauma. Jesus sends them into the storm. And then, of course, when Jesus comes towards them, there's that moment when they say, "Is that you? Is that you coming now? Where have you been? It's been 40 minutes. My trousers are all wet. Where have you been?" There's also that moment for us when the suffering is drawing to a close or there's a gap in the curtains and we can see the light. Where have you been? Did you not know? Do you not know, God, how difficult it is to suffer? Well, of course, Of course, God knows, of course. And so as we start to journey through this week, as we start to think about stepping out of the boat, I wonder where you are. Now, a great number of you in this room, I'm conscious of the fact that a great number of you in this room will have been Christians for twice as long as I've been alive. I'm only 24. And I hope I didn't hear somebody tut then. So it's a context really where I'm still very young in my faith, I suppose in many ways. But I wonder where our journey is taking us. As you know, Outlook doesn't believe, fundamentally we don't believe that older people are of less value. We actually believe that older people are of more value. But for your journey now, what is it that you come to conference with? What is it that is biting at your ankles? What is it that's brought you here with great joy? I had a conversation with someone earlier today, and it may well be that that person and I, by chance, stumbled on something that that person should do next. It may not be, but it may be. But where will God challenge you to step out of the boat in these 4 days? For me, I need to have more faith that God is in charge of Outlook. I mean, I don't suppose many directors of charities would say that, but I need more faith that God is in charge of Outlook. Now, of course, I know He is, and John and Jill constantly remind me that He is, and I know Bible verses that will prove that He is, but I need to know that He is. I'm going on a stag weekend after this, which is often the way to finish a good Christian conference. I was reminded of my brother-in-law, and he was a bit of a wild guy in his time. And on his stag weekend, he knew he was going to be in trouble. He actually said, I knew it was going to happen, Rob, I just had to go with it. So in the middle of Southampton, his friends dressed him in a chicken suit. And they took him to, I think somewhere ferries go from Southampton somewhere else. And they told him that his ferry was leaving from the other side of town with about the time left it would take him to run through the town dressed as a chicken to catch his ferry. And we got onto the ferry dressed as chicken. The man at the ferry said, good evening, Mr. Slatter. We've been expecting you. And so for the stag do that comes for me at the weekend, I wonder what will be the things that I'm left with? What will be the memories that I take from this 3 or 4 days? I want to suggest that for some of us, we are going to be challenged. Now, on stag do's, sometimes they do this thing called pegging. I don't know, I'm going to guess that most of you haven't been on a stag do in a while. Now, sometimes what people do is they get these clothes pegs and they peg them onto, the back of the trousers or the back jacket or whatever of the stag. And if he gets more than 20 pegs on his jacket, he has to buy a round of drinks, you see. Filthy practice, deplorable. Now, so our youth leaders at church on Sunday said that they were going to peg the fathers in church, and on the pegs were written verses of encouragement, you see. No, I gave my peg to somebody else, and you could take pegs to the front and all this sort of thing. I stayed in the corner. I sit in the corner of our church, and I sit where the homeless people and the alcoholics come and sit, because it's kind of where I belong, really. And I gave my peg to a guy called John, and somebody came and gave me a peg. Searched me out. Nobody was coming anywhere near us because I was right in the far corner. Someone came and gave me a peg, and it said, "Trust in God." So I know that, if you pardon the expression, God is on my case. You know, months and months and months ago, when I just picked out of nowhere Step Out of the Boat, and I can't honestly tell you why I chose to call it Step Out of the Boat, I have no idea. But 5 times in the last 2 months, something to do with Step Out of the Boat has come to my attention. It's been spoken about in church. It's been spoken about where on weekends where my friends have gone. And then I came back from a meeting with a couple of trustees last week, which was really important, really good. And we'd been talking about stepping out of the boat. And my son Jonah came back from youth group. Got back from London, whizzed him into town, came back, had something to eat, picked him up, you know, how it is to rush around. I said, how was it tonight? He said, yeah, it was good, Dad. Do you know what we did about? Do you know what we did? I said, don't tell me. Was it about step out of the boat? He said, yeah, how did you know that? So I know that Almighty God is saying to Rob Rolls, step out of the boat. I know that. But where is it for you? And I want to ask you, this week, I want to ask you to be really open. Now, I've been a professional Christian since about 1991, so it's been my job. My Christianity has been part of my faith, and my faith has got me to my job, and, you know. So I've been on all sorts of conferences, and I've been on clergy conferences and youth work conferences. I've had the terrible experience of being on conferences in the Bahamas 4 times. All expenses paid. And it's hard. And I want to step out the boat again and go to the Bahamas again. I feel that's... But when you've been to conferences like this, you know, there's a bit of a routine, isn't there? But I want to challenge you. If this is your first Outlook conference, or if it's your 3rd or 4th, however many, I want to ask you to be open and allow God to do something different. Because I have to say to you folks that there is no doubt at all in my mind that Almighty God is doing something different with Outlook Trust. 2 years ago, somebody was in this very room at this very conference, and they said, we're looking for a new director. At that time they said that I was doing something else. I'd never heard of Outlook. I was firmly convinced that I would be working with young people for a long time. And then through a whole host of circumstances, that just was torn away from me. And I came to work for Outlook, and I did a few weeks working for the charity in our old offices. What were they called? I can't remember now. What were the old offices called? Wycliffe Centre, there you go. And even though John and Jill were lovely and the trustees were very welcoming, I thought to myself, this isn't for me. So I did a few days there, and I still thought this isn't for me. Then I drove down the M40 on my way back up to Yorkshire after a few days down there, and I listened to the CDs, and I heard somebody say, this is what the new director must be. I didn't for 1 minute think that was me. But at Junction 4, this remarkable thing happened. I suddenly realised if all these faithful people were praying for a new director, if God was in charge, and if I'd been offered the job, then I'd better step out of the boat and say yes. So I did. And we've had a really interesting few months at Outlook. We're in challenging times. We're in challenging times because we're in a country where the numbers of older people, as you know, are growing. There is a kind of a population explosion, as it were. And the statistics tell you all sorts of things, but within 15 or 20 years, 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 of us will be over 60. I will be amongst that group. And the church has a real opportunity to do something about it. You know, the Church of England, who I've spent so long working for, we had this great history of almost getting to things in time. Almost. It's not, if any of you have been to an Anglican church, you'll know precisely what I mean. We almost got it right. And I spent 27 years as a youth worker, and I wished that when people had said, young people are leaving the church, I wish that the church had done something about it right then, instead of waiting 20 years for confirmation and going, oh, they've all gone, you were quite right. So I say to us now, tonight, there are more older people than before in our country, and there will be more and more. And our challenge is to do something about it. You know, I really believe that at least one of you is being called to pray, to a life of prayer. It would be lovely if someone felt that was them. I felt that a couple of weeks ago. Someone is being called into a life of prayer. You know, speaking once at the church, and my house is in the parish, so my parish church. And as a good evangelical, before I stood up to speak, I prayed with all my might that God would use my words to make a difference to at least one person. And I've preached a few times, though, you know, in my arrogant moments, I think I'm quite good. And that day I thought I was really, really good, if I'm honest. And this lady came up to me at the end, she said, oh, brother. Now, when people say that, you know they're not going to complain. I said, yes, sister. I was using all the language. Oh, brother, she said, that was perfect timing. I thought, this is great. My prayers have been answered. My excellent preaching has made a difference. She said, oh, yes, perfect timing. She said, just as you got up to speak, my hearing aid battery's packed up. Bless her. We're not friends anymore. And you see, God's timing is perfect, even when we don't realize it. So, where is God challenging you to step out of the boat tonight? When you go to your seminar tomorrow, when you go to a Bible study, when you're in the worship, and incidentally, I guess you can see now why Julia and Chris are our worship leaders, can't you? I mean, that was just amazing. Amazing. But when you're worshipping, when you're praying, ask God where you want to step out of the boat. Now, I'm just going to play a song in a moment for a little response for us. I have to say to you, it has some, not swear words in, but strong language, because it talks about the God of everybody. And one of my volunteering things I do in my life is I volunteer in a maximum security prison. And the group that we run happens to be with sex offenders. So there are paedophiles in there. People who will never be released because that would be too dangerous. Now, I was of the naive impression and the slightly arrogant impression when I started feeling called to that particular work, that I would go in there and with my vast array of Bible knowledge behind me, I would teach these folks and my colleagues who help with the group, and probably also the chaplaincy, I would teach them some of my wisdom, and they would come out better people for the experience. Now, instead, what happens is that's the place where my faith is shaped more than anywhere else. And when you have someone who's been in prison for 37 years and he says to you, do you know what? Sometimes the forgiveness of God is so strong, I can't see the bars on my cell window. That's the gospel at work. And so this song makes a reference to some of those things. So I'll pray for us now, and then you might like to continue praying once I start to play. So, Lord, thank you that you were with those first disciples on the floater. And when you called one of them to step out of the boat, he took that step. And even though he sank, he ended up holding your hand, Jesus. And so as we journey through this few days together and we hear from Joanna and Debbie and Anne and all our seminar leaders, help us to be open to where you are calling us and where you are calling Outlook.